Okay, well, welcome. Good morning, everyone. I hope that you're enjoying the IGF. For those in the room who in here, this is their very first IGF USA, by hand. Like half the room. Okay, great. Well, I'm glad that you're involved, and I hope that you're involved every year for the next as many years as we host the IGF. So today's panel is promoting a more inclusive internet. I am Brandy Noneke. I'm a postdoc at UC Berkeley, where I work at the Center for Information Technology Research in the interest of society. Today's speakers are amazing. They're going to share their research and hands-on work developing actually models and implementing them to create a more inclusive internet. So I'll first introduce each of the speakers, just giving their name and title. Their full bios are included in your handout, and they're also included online. So I'll first just say who each of the speakers are, then I have a very quick introduction, and then we'll get into the discussion. So to my left is Jane Coffin. She is the Director of Development Strategy at the Internet Society. To her left is Chris Resendez. I don't know, I jumped one. He is the founder of Index Advisors, Index IoT Impact Labs, and IoT Capital Partners. Vanu Bose is actually to the left of Jane, and he's president and CEO of Vanu Inc. And at the end of the table is Maya Wiley, and she is senior vice president for social justice at the New School and the Henry Cohen Professor of Urban Policy and Management at the New School's Milano School of International Affairs. So globally, over 4 billion people still don't have access to the internet, and this excludes them from critical social, political, and economic inclusion. But how to, at the minimum, identify exactly where these populations are is a difficult task. And then even once we connect them, ensuring that that connection is tethered to opportunity is yet another challenge on top of that. And so today's panel, we're going to discuss opportunities and barriers to creating a more inclusive internet and discuss models for increasing access, but also models for creating opportunities that can be enabled through connectivity. So I'll open up the panel actually by doing a question forward thinking. So in the year 2050, what does an inclusive internet look like? To each of you.
I mean, step one, if you're going to be inclusive, everybody has to have the ability to get online, and that's physical access, that's ability to use the content, and ability to afford it. And I think those are the three key things, and we're pretty far away from all three of those at this point.
I'll add to that, and I agree with what Vanu said. If we actually think of what it should look like, it should actually, I think, be many different internets and not simply one. And what we would see, I think, ideally are a lot of hyper-local models, both of infrastructure's deployment and its use. And the one thing I would add to Vanu's list of what it should produce is innovation. So I think as we're watching not just the innovation economy, but the ability of technology to start to solve social problems, it really should be the case that the technology is actually supporting traditionally excluded communities from actually being able to be innovators themselves, not simply the recipients of innovation.
I'll try to add to that. I think that agree with both points. It'll be, I think, a highly fragmented collection of networks with different tools and methods and points of access. I think that the diversity of communities and their values and their priorities on the planet should be represented. A term we like to use is resilience. So what we'd like to say is by 2050, we would love if the killer app of digitization or digital or internet or internets was resilience. We define that as stable, scalable, agile, secure, profitable, sustainable, and ultimately equitable. And if we can educate or re-educate any community on the planet to conceive of resilience as the killer app for that community through its definition of itself or its identity, and build the technologies and make the technologies available to those communities such that they can use the digital tools synthesized with their traditional methods to achieve resilience, that would be my, I guess, ideal picture of what these internets or networks would look like in 2050.
I'll just briefly add that I think a more inclusive internet in 2050 would include the ability for civil society groups, indigenous communities, and others to actually take a part in the government proceedings that they currently can't take part in, so they can obtain spectrum, get better licenses, more funding.
So one thing that came out of this that I find very interesting is the idea that internet fragmentation can actually benefit communities. And in a lot of other rooms just like this, at a lot of other conferences, there are a lot of people fighting against internet fragmentation. So I'd like to tease out a little bit more on that. Why do you think hyperlocal models are better able to fulfill the needs of those communities and make them more innovative?
Oh, I'll start. One thing I should say, despite I actually served as counsel to Mayor Bill de Blasio and was responsible for his universal broadband strategy. And one of the things, obviously, as an administration that was committed to solving income inequality and seeing technology and its equitable distribution as a key strategy to produce that, is we very quickly realized that the reality of how our broadband policies have developed in the U.S., which fundamentally favored what is now a small number of very large providers, has simply meant we have, at best, business models that are simply not going to serve the 20%, potentially up to 27% of New Yorkers that don't have home-based broadband. And that the only way, and if we look at what that means geographically across the city, it's largely segregated communities of color. We're a city that had 38% immigrant population, 800 languages, and all of the diversity and exclusion that can represent, including undocumented immigrants. And so what that meant was we had to think about not just how we got internet access to folks across the city, but what it actually meant in different communities, to think about what the resources, the access points, the assets were to create those solutions. But it also enabled us, since we were primarily thinking about broadband access itself as a driver of opportunity, not as the end goal, that the question is also, and the reason hyperlocal becomes so important, is what are the problems that the technology and the access are supposed to solve? And the way to do that is to embed that with problem solvers within communities. And so I think similar to what Chris described, you can't do that with large models that frankly are not nimble, not responsive, and are not subject to true civic engagement by the communities that are impacted.
Yeah, I want to take a little issue with the premise of the question, and forgive me, I'm an engineer, so the technical details matter. I think we need to distinguish between access fragmentation and internet fragmentation. You know, access has to be fragmented or differentiated because people have different ways and different affordabilities of internet. It might be community internet, it might be cellular, it might be TV white space. That's great. But you don't want internet fragmentation so the community cellular people get online and they're on a different internet from Amazon and Google. That's not good. So I think its access has to be differentiated, and it's not, because it is too centralized. It's all kind of done the same way, and there isn't that differentiation.
One thing I would note is that I work with communities around the world, so this is not a U.S. Perspective per se, even though I am from the United States. So we shouldn't decide for people what their access looks like. They should be able to create their own community-based networks, which is one of my favorite topics, or internet exchange points, to build local infrastructure, working with technologists like Vanu and others, Internet Engineering Task Force, sort of a shameless plug as well, some people we work with, to come up with that technology to bring the price points down, to allow that accessibility, and to bring that sustainability from the community out. I'd love us to stop saying the last mile is the rural area, because in 1984, a report came out called The Missing Link. Some of you in the room may know it. Shocker, people weren't connected. What year are we in now? People are still not connected. So let's map where the connectivity isn't. Let's look at how those networks can be deployed and how we can do that. So from a fragmentation perspective, I would say it's not fragmented. It's actually building in to the nodes, right, or out to, so.
I like Jane's point about, this rural versus urban. Also, there are many people in urban settings who are not connected. And Maya, I really liked your comments about these different models to drive inclusion. Do you guys have any examples of different models that help to drive connectivity and opportunities to actually innovate and build upon the internet?
I'm happy to start with some of the things we've done in New York and some of the efforts also in Detroit, which are very interesting because they're very different approaches. Detroit for the past, which is 85% black, largely low income, highly segregated, and in bankruptcy, and largely from a lot of historic disinvestment, has actually a very, very bottom-up model, very, very community-based model of how it's been struggling with internet access and digital inclusion, largely because there's been an absence of government participation in trying to figure out, and private sector participation in trying to figure out how to get folks online. And New York is sort of the opposite problem, where there were lots of digital inclusion efforts, and government was certainly thinking about how to continue to grow as the second largest tech sector in the country, but not actually thinking about it from a sort of bottom-up, community-based approach to what infrastructure should then look like. So I think what we were trying to add on to is how do we actually think about government not in just a traditional municipal broadband model, because we, for a whole bunch of reasons, we're not going to have that approach in an 8.5 million person city with 330 square miles and a whole bunch of islands. But we certainly could think about, and it wouldn't necessarily serve all our ends, to Jane's point, but we could certainly think about how we were able to leverage our franchises, which first step actually was our public payphone franchise, and taking that and Link NYC and creating a public-private partnership where we were essentially taking what was an antiquated franchise and turning it into free wireless hotspots that were going to be 1 gig speed in almost all the kiosks, and creating in the negotiation guaranteed income for the city as a way for the city to start to have revenue that then it could generate into hyper-local places, in our case public housing developments, for unit-based free broadband. So we have a commitment of 21,000 public housing residents in every borough. We're starting in Queensbridge, which is in Queens, and going then to Brooklyn, to Red Hook. But the point was to look for the community partnerships so that communities and the tenants associations would participate in both understanding what kind of wireless network we were going to be able to pay for putting in, but also thinking about how to pull together the community partners so that the community partners could be thinking about also what else they could do with the access once it was there and how to support people's use of it. And I think the next set of questions, which is I think some of what we can learn from other parts of the globe, is the sustainability models for that, since we are offering essentially a city-funded, we're essentially the city putting in CapEx for free service up to 25 megabits per second, but not with the intent of displacing the private sector, but in sort of challenging the private sector. It's like, fine, it's going to be free for everybody in these buildings. So you can either compete with it by providing a cheaper service that's faster, meaning not cheaper than free, but cheaper than what they're currently providing, because it's not that there aren't providers, the price points are just simply too high. And frankly, the service is not as good as it's advertised to be. The speeds are rarely what they're advertised, as we know, and that's particularly true in public housing. And we have, the vast majority of the residents are either elderly or young, or under 18, which means you also have to think about those two demographics, which have very different models of inclusion when you think about digital inclusion. So, we're both hoping it's a challenge to the private sector to participate more robustly, but also a guarantee, and then a way for the community to think about a sustainability model that it can control in terms of the free service that it will have.
So we're working on the other end of the problem, not the urban problem, but the rural problem. And these are generally areas where there is no connectivity or no coverage. And this is really hard for me to admit as an engineer, but the rural connectivity problem is not a technical problem. It's an economic problem. Fundamentally, you would have coverage in these areas if it was economically viable for the existing carriers to do it. What happens in rural areas is a couple of things. First, you have lower population density, so you have lower number of people per cell site, and their average revenue per user is much lower. Here we're 50-something dollars. In rural Rwanda, where we have a network, it's $1 a month. Now, so you're getting less revenue per cell site. Then to make matters worse, it's actually more expensive to run the networks in these rural areas because they're typically off-grid, so you have to run on diesel. And if you build a traditional cell site, it costs about $4,000 a month in diesel. So you can do the math. $4,000 a month in diesel fuel, $1 a month from a small number of subscribers. It doesn't work, so they don't build. So we focused on how do we change that equation to make the OpEx lower than the revenue. And we did it by combining technology and business model innovation in 3 ways. So the first was we had to get rid of off of diesel. It's the biggest expense. It's a disaster for the environment. In fact, we did a calculation. Somebody did a calculation that if you were to cover the rest of Africa, you'd need 60,000 more cell towers. That would be about burning, I think it was 425 million additional gallons of diesel fuel a year. So it's really not environmentally sustainable. And diesel is the #1 theft items at cell sites, diesel fuel and the diesel generator. So it increases your security costs. So a typical cell site takes a 10 kilowatt generator, which is really too big to cost effectively run off solar and battery. So what we did was we said, well, this was the engineering part of it, let's re-engineer the cell site with the idea for minimizing power. So our entire site backhaul charging takes 90 watts of power that we have built in Rwanda today. At 90 watts, you can run off solar, and guess what? It doesn't take a whole lot of battery to go 24 hours without sun if you're only using 90 watts. So that was one piece, but even that wasn't enough to make the model work. The second was we created a wholesale business model. So we're doing cellular, but we don't have any subscribers. Instead, we build a network in these uncovered areas and then go to the carriers and say, let's cut a deal where we'll share the revenue you get from these subscribers. You don't have to pay anything for the service. We get multiple subscriber bases using one network, so we get more revenue per cell site. And we have 2 networks now, one in rural Rwanda and one in rural Vermont. They're more similar than you would believe. In Vermont, we have 10 carriers, both US and Canadian, using the network. So we have pieces of 10 subscriber bases amortizing the cost of one network. And then the third and final piece I love because with our analysis, we've done this in rural Vermont, in several African countries, and now rural India, and it's the same everywhere, which is that in rural areas, people tend to live in small towns and villages or otherwise within a couple kilometers of some road. Now, in Rwanda, it's not a paved road. Sometimes it's not even a good dirt road, but everybody needs some form of access. And our goal is to cover where people live, work, and commute. And we realized if we cover the roads in 2 kilometers on either side, we'll get over 90% of the places where people live, work, and commute. Now, when you go 2 kilometers, I don't need a 300-foot cell tower. In Rwanda, we built a 10-meter pole. In Vermont, we just put them on existing telephone poles. So one of the things Vermont loves about us is we're not building big, ugly cell towers on the landscape. So you combine the solar, the wholesale, and the small cell architecture, and the economics are 10x better for running a network. To give you a data point, our break-even threshold for a site in Vermont is $135 a month. That's all we have to generate to get break-even. In Rwanda, unfortunately, it's more. It's $650 because we're using satellite coverage, and that's more expensive. But still, if we're covering a couple thousand people per site, and I need $650 at $1 a subscriber, you can get there, and you can make it work. So the last thing I want to say is that, I think there's a lot of attention on the last billion, the next 3 billion, whatever it is, which are mostly global. There is a big problem, which Maya talked about here in the US. There's 23 million people in rural America without broadband. 47% of the students in schools don't have broadband. A lot of those are urban, but a lot of them are also rural. I'll give you one example of how similar they are. Our first site that we put up in Rwanda lit up both a school and a hospital with no connectivity. And the hospital was tremendous. The doctors had to leave the hospital and go all the way down the road to make a phone call if they needed to. A month ago, we lit up a site in Vermont covering a hospital with no wireless connectivity. No one was surprised that there was a hospital in Rwanda with no connectivity. Everyone was shocked that there was one in rural America without it. But we do have the same level of problems, and we have to address them with the same attention.
one thing that I found very interesting is this idea of the public-private partnerships, but that it must be a collaboration between local communities, government, and private sector. What are some of the opportunities and barriers to tapping into this infrastructure? So in Vermont, I'm sure that you had a lot of conversations about using the telephone poles. And then also I want to make sure, Chris, too, talking about deployment of IoT technology. So communities actually deploying their own connected devices and how you help to foster and support their ability to do that.
Sure. So echoing some of what Vanu said, our approach is probably a little different than everyone on the panel in that we're not as concerned, I would say, with connectivity for the consumption of content. We're concerned about connectivity for the creation of context. In other words, trying to get data from the physical world. Sensors on water wells or level presence water quality monitors in creeks, rivers or streams, spring-fed ponds or dam-created reservoirs, for example. I'll just use water as an example. I think we are in a water security crisis in more communities in North America today than most people realize, because we don't know if there's water and if there is how much, and if there is a fair amount and it's plentiful, if it's clean or not. And I'm not just talking about Flint, Michigan, and I'm not just talking about the Southwest US. I'm talking about where I live in eastern Massachusetts. Last year, 60% of those 400 roughly cities and towns were in a severe drought crisis. 60% in New England. It was barely written about. We had some family restaurants, family farms, either go out of business or close down during the high season for lack of groundwater. In cities and towns that had what we call split systems, where half of the quote-unquote meters or valves, if you will, or draws on that water were on a quote town system, infrastructure pipes, but the other half of consumers were on quote private water wells, with very little concern or consideration publicly for the idea that those pipes, one is a physical conduit and the other is a natural river or stream or creek that are both in many cases fed by the same aquifer or aquifer infrastructure. In other words, the idea that I'm on town water and it's coming out and I don't have an impact on my neighbors who are on quote private water wells is tragic. So what we're concerned about is this idea that why do we want to get people connected? What is the point? What is the purpose? And so what we like to try to do is understand from this lens that we have, who is in this community? Who are these people? What do they do? What is the thing that they do? What are the production or the creation, or what are the valuable activities that define who these people are? Are they soft goods assemblers? Are they leather toolers? Are they farmers? Are they fishermen? Are they small machine shops? Are they metal stampers? Are they knitters, sewers, educators? Is it a research organization? We don't care. What we care about is, as they're creating value, historically, today, in the future, what part of the physical world are they quote-unquote exploiting or converting from raw material or somehow undeveloped materials or opportunities into something of value? Our obsession is with helping every one of those communities find a toehold in quote-unquote an export economy. Something, some product, some service, some experience that every community delivers so well that someone outside the boundary of that town or that city wants it. And so we think it's really important that we start with the parts of the physical world that matter most or that are under most pressure, get them instrumented intentionally, intelligently, securely, and let's find networks. We don't care. We scavenge, we harvest, we use what is available, and then we look to people like Vanu to help us augment or extend the capabilities to get the most precious data out of those most precious physical environments. Because here's what ends up happening. Once you can give farmers real-time data about soil conditions or microclimate on a very high resolution, and when we say microclimate, we've got some experiments, we've got farmers proving that 8 sensors on 1 acre of land is the appropriate point of presence for them to study temperature in topsoil or temperature in soil at depth. 8 sensors per acre, with changes in temperature at surface or at depth ranging from 5 to 8 degrees in a single acre. So while the top of the soil may look uniform, maybe 7 out of 8 of those zones don't need water. That's a massive cost savings for that farmer, but also it's a massive conservation impact on something like water security. Getting that kind of application rolled out, getting it documented, and then getting it to scale, for us, that's the tip of the spear or the tip of connectivity, because we can justify economically, conservationally, from a community perspective, that we need to invest in connectivity. And then maybe the traditional consumer-oriented consumption of content comes after. So we're a little bit different because we're a little bit obsessed with the physical world, and a lot of those sensors are small, low power, short bursty data, and the networks that are appropriate for that short bursty data from a sensor are in fact very poor quality of service for a human conversation. But I want to be clear about that. The value that can be created from giving that data or making that data available in some kind of local network, licensed or unlicensed, into a cell phone that maybe doesn't have a cellular SIM hot or running. It's got Wi-Fi, it's got Bluetooth connectivity or Wi-Fi connectivity, and soon low-power wide area networking connectivity can change the fortunes of billions of people on this planet, even if they never get to have a high QoS real-time voice exchange. So how do you do that? You scavenge and you harvest what you have. And that's one of the reasons why we're happy to be up here with Vanu, is because if you have a water tower, we're good to go. I mean, we'll drop a Vanu station on the top of a water tower. If you've got a barn that's got 40 or 45 or 50-foot height at the apex and the peak of that roof, we're good to go. If you've already got any kind of power, if you've got any kind of connectivity, what we're trying to espouse here is this idea that you don't need 5G. You don't need necessarily fiber to the curb. What you need is to go into the community and understand who these people are, what they're proud of in their history, and where they want to go next, and help them exploit that with resilience.
I would just add to what Chris is saying about going into the communities, and I'm going to spin this into where you talk about partnerships and new different funding models. With respect to going into the communities, we found that we often have to sit with the village chief, the headman or woman of the village. This is in India, where you don't go in and say, we have a great solution for you. You don't tell people what to think and do, which is part of what the Internet Society espouses. It's more, is there anything we can do? Here are some models that we know of, whether it's Vanu's or the Rhizomatica model in Oaxaca, Mexico, or the model for the Digital Empowerment Foundation's Wireless for Communities project in India. It is, what can that partnership do to help that community, whether it's educating kids through wiring schools, creating small micro enterprise, but the sustainability issue is not just about money, it's about people and the partnerships. This is all about the humans, because they either run those machines, build that connectivity, and the harvesting issue, lots of people go to scrap metal places to get the metal to build the arrays. We're not talking about something fancy out of a box in some communities, as you know. Or if there is something we've gotten out of a box and donated, are we the new micro JVs, right? Micro JVs. I'm not saying the Internet Society is a joint venture organization. We're a nonprofit. We work all over the world. We have feet on the ground. The key thing is listening to people, finding out what works. The models are going to be different in different places. In Zenzaleni, which is a network in the Eastern Cape in South Africa, I was just with a colleague from there last week, we gave him a $2,500 grant, 2500, for a tower. He couldn't pay per month that same amount of money to rent space on a tower. Back to the point Chris and Vanu were making, some of the old issues we talked about years ago as regulators, policymakers, companies, access to infrastructure is important. And you've got to break down the barriers. In a lot of countries right now, some of the old thinking of backhaul from the submarine cable landing station needs to be liberalized. You've got to get connectivity in and out, bringing down the price point on satellite feeds, and liberalization of some of that infrastructure for the last mile, middle mile. Last mile might be not the last mile, as I said, but how do you break down those costs and provide partnerships for that access, which is sustainable? So I should say in some of those networks, like the one in Oaxaca, they're paying $2 to $3 a month for a 2G network for voice over IP. They wanted voice over IP. They don't want smartphones right now. There will be backhauling connectivity later. So there are different models out there that could be adaptable. So I think the key word here is flexibility, and let's not just talk about imposing solutions on people that we haven't talked to. Yeah.
So a whole bunch of things that both of you guys brought up, a lot of good points. But I want to emphasize one that you both made is, there's a lot of focus on bringing broadband to the rest of the world. Well, if you don't have anything, voice SMS is incredibly valuable. I hear people talk about, telemedicine in rural Africa, where we can video in and examine the baby, and it's like, wait a minute. Where they are today is if your baby's sick, you wrap them up and walk 10 kilometers to the hospital. Telemedicine is being able to pick up the telephone and call the doctor. It's a huge improvement. And so, in where we are in Rwanda, there's a 4G network in Rwanda and a 3G and a 2G. Every single phone we see out in the rural area is 2G. It's affordable. The plans are affordable. And I think a very underestimated factor is battery life. You get these Nokia flip phones. They last 3 days. That's really important if you don't have power. An iPhone ain't going to do it. But what these people do, there's a lot of people on Facebook who use just the SMS updating feature and get on there. So I think it's more important to start by getting them connected and then moving them up in speed into other applications. And I'm very interested in what Chris is doing, because one of the sort of revelations we had when we built our first sites in rural Rwanda was we're not just building connectivity here, we're building the first infrastructure in this area, right? There's no power, there's no telecom. So we started thinking, what else could we do with it? Well, if these could be sites that are IoT hubs, and now you can start helping the farmers and everything, we can layer all that on. It's really an infrastructure play, which gets the question you asked, Brandy, about what about access to infrastructure? And there's some very interesting challenges that are different in Rwanda and Vermont. One of the things we always want to know is, where's the fiber? It's not always where we want it, but if we could figure out where it is, we can get a wireless link to the fiber and connect to it. Well, there's a whole bunch of different fiber networks in Vermont, but they all close hold the information because they view it as competitive. They don't want their competitors to know where they are. So it's like this archaeological experiment to go figure out who has fiber where and what can we connect to. Rwanda, a little more centralized in the government. They have a map of all the fiber in the country, all the towers, everything. It was great. We could just get it in one stop. One thing Vermont did really well, which a lot of other states have not, is they harmonized the process and rates for attaching to poles. So you go through one approval process, you're qualified. There's 7 different power providers. Some of them are co-ops. It's all the same. You go to Pennsylvania, you have to negotiate with each individual power or telco company. And they're, of course, trying to locally optimize and extract as much rent as they can, whereas the state realized, no, it's a good that people use this infrastructure. Let's make it easy to do. Then the last point, which is kind of a sad one in Rwanda, so great. We had all this information. We planned our whole network. 85% of our sites, we could take one microwave hop to a tower where we could get fiber. And that's awesome. Well, what happens is, the government funded the fiber network. They put it into this sort of public-private partnership with KT Telecom, Korea Telecom, and one tower company came in and bought up all the towers, so they're de facto monopolies. So it turns out, yeah, we could get it, but it's $450 a month to put a radio on the tower and $200 per megabit to connect to the fiber at the base of the tower. And we looked at that's $650 for your first megabit, and we realized satellite's cheaper. I have shared 87 megabits for $650 per site. So, that's just an artificially created by creating de facto monopolies. An artificial economic barrier was created, whereas the infrastructure is actually really good.
One quick question for you, and this is a big deal for many of the community networks and everyone we know. Was spectrum easily charted for you so that you knew where the spectrum wasn't, and was there secondary use allowed, shared use allowed, and or full-on licensing?
Right. So spectrum is one of the big challenges, getting access to it. Building it is not that hard.
The Holy Grail.
And we've done 2 different things in Vermont and Rwanda, so it's useful to talk through them both for the differences. In Vermont, we leveraged something the FCC did, I think, almost 10 years ago now, called secondary markets, which allowed a spectrum licensee to sell, lease, lend, loan spectrum to a third party. That wasn't allowed before. Okay, so good news, it's possible, but people were still holding on to their spectrum. But we went to Sprint, who has really not a very good network in Vermont, and we cut a deal with them. And we have 20 megahertz of Sprint spectrum in Vermont that we can use to support all kinds of carriers. Of course, Sprint gets a pretty good deal because they're the spectrum provider, but that actually works. I think secondary markets is great. It is in a number of different countries. India just last May finally passed some legislation which allowed similar things. So one of the things as we look to expand into different countries, is that legislation in place or not? Now, Rwanda is an interesting case because when I first went there and met with the regulator, their position was, hey, we don't have any rules that prevent that kind of transaction. It's okay to do. But the problem was no African carrier had ever done a spectrum transaction. And spectrum are like the crown jewels, right? So kind of scary to do a transaction with it. Everybody was unsure. The regulator, and this is one of the reasons we started in Rwanda, they're very proactive and very aggressive about coverage. What he said is, look, we have spectrum that we'd reserved for a fourth operator, which they weren't going to deploy because 3 is almost too much competition in Rwanda and the operators are struggling. So what they did is they gave us a 2-year license with this constraint. So they didn't want to give us a license that could compete with the operators, but they said, if you can show that there is no carrier with coverage there, we'll give you a 2-year license. And what I told them is 2 years is good enough. After 2 years, people will be comfortable with it. We can go strike a deal with a carrier. So we identify our sites. The regulator has to send someone out to each of the sites, do the measurement. If there's no coverage, we get a license. And we pay a small amount for it, which is reasonable. But that was a very proactive thing that the regulator did with rural coverage. And while not all of them have like 900 megahertz spectrum, probably most of them have 3G and 4G that's not allocated in rural areas, and they could replicate that. And I do think all you need is a temporary license, people get comfortable with the model, and then we can strike commercial deals.
So I just wanted to I'm taking notes because there are several things that, I think relate. For one, we have to, if we're really going to make meaningful change, we have to figure out a way to talk about this as an urban and rural issue that is really interlinked. And we're still both politically and pragmatically thinking of them as two competing spheres. And so either rural's going to win or urban's going to win. And that's just a failing framework, but that is the way it works politically, right, is they become competitive. So this actually is a good example of both ideas and the potential for partnerships that also think about how those become one conversation and not more than separate, because that's where fragmentation shouldn't be happening, is the notion that these are shared needs. When I think about the urban context, one of the things that strikes me is the notion both of regulation and the fact that we're in a political environment that's trying to limit local innovation, not in all states, and secondly, the fragmentation of political decision-making within states is a complicated one because there are things that the city of New York, for example, would do that the state might not. But at the same time, you can understand why innovators get bogged down in the fact that there's sort of a multi-tiered regulatory framework that they have to go through to get anything done. And one of the things I just want to add into this that people often don't think enough about is when we start to talk about this regulatory space, most government players, particularly in cities and towns and rural areas, have actually no capacity to actually think about and do the things that we're talking about on this panel. And one of the things that we had to realize, in the city of New York, if you want, I was staggering that in a city like New York City, to find that there's like one guy that can't get hit by a bus because he's got in his head like all this information that enables you to actually do the permitting process for some of the wireless. It's crazy. And we still, as a government, have a system where we have to find pieces of paper and walk them from one place to the other. And we have no idea what's going on underneath the streets, by and large, because we have over 100 years of infrastructure in the streets where there's actually no transparency in. And by the way, the big telecommunications firms don't even want to tell you what they know, even though they're legally required to, and you have to go through a process of potentially even suing them to get the information that you're actually allowed to get under your franchise agreements because they're so afraid of their proprietary infrastructure. So I say all this because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding that happens around whenever we start to talk about the bottom-up approach and the importance of cities and towns starting to do something. Sometimes what you have to do is in the absence of that community partnership just to get it started because the capacity is so limited. and the experience is so limited. And so in the same way that you're talking about this kind of proof of concept in the private sector context, we have to actually do it in the government sector context as well. Because, and even just to start doing something for communities that start to build some trust that government is actually trying to partner, means sometimes delivering a good and just getting it done.
You brought up a great point, and I see it here and in Africa, is that the governments don't have the knowledge or expertise to do this. So I want to tell you guys about something that I'm starting with Megan Smith, the former White House CTO. It's in the concept page. I want to bring it up because I think there's a bunch of people in the room who might help. We're calling it the Connectivity Core. Think about it as Doctors Without Borders for engineers, or Engineers Without Borders. So the idea is, if there's a project, a country wants to do this, like look at fiber access or what all, we have a bunch of volunteers that will go over for a week or a month to work with the government. You know, imagine you get some guys from Google or Facebook who are willing to give 2 weeks of their time to go work, or work with the city of New York for that matter, right? And put it together. So we're looking for support in pulling this together and a place for it to live. But we think, you know, both of us independently through our work identified this as a real problem. But there's tons of people willing to help. We just have to give them a framework to do it.
And the thing I would add to that is the policy framework. So that's I mean, I'm not the engineer, I'm the policy person, but one of the things that strikes me that also moves too quickly for government often, and the Internet of Things and data is a really good example of this, is folks are giving away the crown jewels for free. And often, and in some instances, exposing communities in ways that they should not be exposed. And so there's an ethical and human rights framework that we also need to have the ability to layer on top of the engineering innovations that we can do, so that we do have something that serves all of the values and purposes that have already been expressed on the panel.
One thing I would say about the connectivity core sounds fabulous. However, I would say that one thing it could focus on, we are keenly focused at the Internet Society on training local people to train each other. You cannot, I used to work on aid projects, and the most effective USAID projects that I knew on the ground were those that trained local people, trained each other from the local circumstance. Because if you try and go in and say again, hey, I know better than you do, that will not work, it'll backfire, and you might as well throw your money out the window of the airplane as you head in. One thing I would say about government, project in South Africa just has gotten the attention thanks to Mozilla. They didn't win the top prize for innovation in this project, but they came in second. The government woke up and said, wow, the Universal Service Administration Fund in South Africa, and now they're meeting with the network in Zenzaleni to talk to them about how to re-administer funding. I would say to anyone who's a government official in this room, Universal Service is broken around the world. Yes. Millions of dollars, if not billions, sit in funds in some countries. They're afraid to touch it because it's a political element. So
if it's still there.
If it's still there, true. Because it may have magically disappeared. We know how that happens, but it happens everywhere. But the question is, can we come up with new innovative ways for small grants with the bank, with USAID, with others to talk about, and with companies? A little goes a long way. How do you look at the metrics? This is something that John Garrity from USAID has focused on a lot more than we have. But what are the key business models, and can we disperse that data through this connectivity core or through other projects? And as you were speaking, I was thinking, okay, there are a bunch of things we'd have to articulate as to what projects exist where, what's working, what isn't. And to your point about the government officials, I used to be one, want to work with the private sector. I got myself educated on certain things at one point in time because I didn't know what IPv6 was 15 years ago, and then I was on the task force in the US. But the key thing was, I got it. I understand architecture. And so government officials aren't fools, but they need help. And so if there's a way to do that training for government officials as well, and we do that, a little bit of that in some of our projects. It depends on the country, it depends on the availability of their time and effort, but it's worthwhile, I think, to take that time.
And I want to just build on and challenge Chris in a good way, because one of the things that I think, given some of the things that have happened at a hyper-local level, and not just in New York, I'm not referring only to New York here, but is, you know, how we think about the Internet of Things and how localities think about the Internet of Things very, very differently. So for example, when in the Red Hook initiative, one of the reasons why we picked Red Hook, which is a set of housing developments that is in flood zones was damaged badly by Hurricane Katrina and the subject of some of the horrific reporting about what happened to public housing residents after, Hurricane Sandy. The resilience actually was the community group had put up a mesh wireless network that was really part of building the social capital and the organizing of the community, and it survived the storm, and it was part of how the community stayed in touch with each other and figured out how to get some of the supports they needed. And we thought, well, we have a community that already self-organized a street-level mesh network. How do we connect that and think about how we're connecting in a residential network with that and with the social capital that's been built? But that is a ripe example now that the city's going to put in that infrastructure for thinking about an Internet of Things play where there is a data sovereignty model that is serving in an area that is deeply imperiled in terms of climate change and flooding and hurricanes, and is poor but also gentrifying and all of those issues, with how you actually start to build on top of that the Internet of Things model that starts to serve resiliency and equity in all the ways we've talked about.
Thank you for the setup. So I'll share a story. They won't be, I don't think, as dramatic as Vanu's, but I think they'll be interesting. So I agree with everything that this panel's saying, but I'm going to put a fine point on a couple things, I hope. And the first one is, when I sat with my first farmer, I'm not a farmer. When I was a little kid, I tried to plant watermelons. It didn't work because I tried to plant them in the same area where my 85-pound German Shepherd ran. So I wasn't real good at it. But so I sat with the first farmer and I thought, I am going to deliver a toolkit to this guy that is going to potentially change his life. I didn't say that to him, but I can tell you, I made the cardinal sin, broke the cardinal rule. I thought I was going to parachute in very quietly, without fanfare, and present this sort of golden kit of tools to this guy who's got a new baby and a new wife, and he's mortgaged to the hilt because he's going to grow protein, damn it. And after he let me embarrass myself for about 10 minutes, he said, all that's cool. If I could understand any of it, it's cool. But let me tell you what I really need. And here's what he said, and this might be new to some of you. He said, look, I'm raising chicken the best way I know how, and I'm selling it wholesale in Boston. Whole chicken, not just chicken breast, wholesale, $7 a pound. Now, when you go to a supermarket anywhere in Greater Boston and you look for chicken breast, at retail, it's around $3.50 a pound. I'm talking whole chickens, wholesale, $7 a pound. He said, if it's in the morning and it's a customer I know, but as the day goes on and the customers are newer to me, it's harder and harder for me to get $6 a pound. Because I'm the only one who does all three routes on the same day. I'm the marketing person, I'm the salesperson, and I'm the delivery person. Whereas the larger food system or the larger food distribution chain has someone who is marketing, probably very well dressed, very well spoken, and talking about high concept. And then a second person comes around a week or two or a day later and actually takes an order, or the order's done online. And then a third person or a third entity shows up in a big truck and drops it off. But what this guy said to me was, I don't need your help increasing production. I don't need your help decreasing risk. I need your help with doing one thing. Help me get $7 a pound for my chicken all day long, regardless of who I'm visiting. What he needed was a traceability solution that would attest to the fact that that chicken, even though it was in a dirty cooler on a dirty truck and he's got rabbit pellets in his boot and grease on his jeans, that the people who didn't know him at 4 o'clock in the afternoon would trust that chicken was cold, dark, and appropriately humid at 4 p.m. on a Thursday. Because if he can get $7 a pound, he can be more profitable. If he can be more profitable, he can practice more sustainability. If he practices more sustainability, he's going to enhance production, stability, and all those cool things are going to happen. But it took listening, part one. Part two is this. I think we've got a lot of challenges in getting the technology community to rethink almost everything when it comes to doing the kinds of things we're trying to do with IoT. I'm going to give you one example. Who knows dark design? Well, I'm going to share something with you that could probably get me hurt. Do you know that most of the mobile applications that you're using to consume or to buy online have been driven by something called dark design? Dark design is really simple. Keep you on your phone pushing as many buttons or widgets as possible so that as much data as possible can be extracted from you before you abandon the transaction. That's dark design. Let me be clear. If you can if in all reality you can buy a movie ticket online with 3 plinks in 8 seconds, then why do you have to have 12 plinks in 25 seconds? Why? Because that's what, quote, the system can get out of you. That's dark design. Dark design's intention is to keep you online creating data for data warehouses that can be sold into black or gray markets for advertisers. If you're going to drop the transaction at 26 seconds, they're going to keep you on for 25. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad thing or a good thing. I'm saying that's what it is. That won't work for farmers, for fishermen, for factory operators, for first responders, or for people who've chosen to be in the real world. 2 examples I give you of just how differently we need to be thinking about the technology. One is we need to be smaller and we need to be quieter. And I've learned that from the Lakota Sioux, who've invited us in to work with them. We're in Pine Ridge. We've been in Standing Rock. We'll be in Rosebud and Porcupine and Yankton. And we're not teaching them much. In being smaller and being quieter, they're teaching us how to do all the things that we've all been hoping we can get out of water security and food security. The only thing we're teaching them about is the sensor. They're teaching us everything else. The second part is the technical discussion. Hyper-concentrating data in a superNOC in a cloud that's thousands of miles away from sacred sites or from, say, the Port of New Bedford, which is the lifeblood not just of the city of New Bedford, but it generates $9 billion of economic value for the state of Massachusetts. To take that data and ship it thousands of miles away was a non-starter for that fleet. We're working with the commercial fishing fleet primarily because they trust us, and they trust us primarily because we're listening to them, and what we heard was, if I'm here, and the fish are here, and the boat's here, the data's here. I want to be really clear with you folks. These people are not Luddites. These people are not they. Farmers know more about data than I probably ever will. And the last thing I'll leave you with, because I'm speechifying, is Cathay Reynolds from Colorado State said, Chris, when it comes to data, you can have my husband, you can have his guns, you can have his dog, but not mine. But you cannot have the data about my family land, my family ranch, my family farm. I know how valuable the data is. And just because other people are giving their data away in social and mobile and other applications doesn't mean that we're going to also. I would submit to you that whether it's Singapore or Standing Rock, whether it's Paris or Pine Ridge, that a tier 1 or frontier market, folks are not stupid, they're not noobs, and the younger these people are, the more digitally native they are going to shock in a good way those of us that listen, and they're going to shock in a bad way those who think they're going to hyper-concentrate data about the physical world in these communities that are apparently struggling. I speechified, I'm sorry. But you set me up.
Speech.
So.
Thank you. You're welcome.
That's good. So what I've really valued about our discussion today is that you've given great examples of how being more collaborative is empowering and it benefits everybody who's working toward making the internet more inclusive. Also, I thought it was very interesting, this idea of really taking stock of what we have available, physical and the non-physical, so policy, practices, and people around how we can develop these models. But with that, I would like to open it up to the audience for questions because I think we have about 10 minutes remaining.
Thank you so much. My name is Ashwita. I work at the AU Institute on Disability and Public Policy. So I have 2 questions to the panel. My first one is, we've spoken a lot about how we can improve access to the internet for people at economic disadvantages. How do we make sure that people who already have, vulnerable communities who already have access to the internet are able to use them, such as persons with disabilities, old persons, persons whose first languages are not English? How do we make sure the internet is more inclusive of them. My second question is, in a lot of the developing countries in these projects that promote internet access, security is often considered an afterthought. So how do we ensure that security is given as much importance in these projects as they are in projects in developed countries and in Western countries? Thank you.
I'll take a stab, a small stab on the security issue, super small. One of the greatest things about what we tend to do in certain regions is we bring people together, we convene practitioners. Please don't underestimate if you're a funder. If someone says, I'm bringing all of these people together from around this region, it's super important. They need to know and see each other to create that network of human connectivity. I call them the human trust networks, because I think everyone on the panel has talked about trust in people and each other. As Chris was saying, the fishermen, I'm from Maine, forget it. If you're not one of them, forget it. To your point, build those networks of trust and start to build the networks of trust and security. We have something called the African Peering and Interconnection Forum, merciless plug for something we do, but that peering forum brings internet exchange point operators, often some of the large content delivery networks who are trying to get content closer to the consumer, and protecting those consumers is another issue about knowing what they're giving away when they're giving away their data and or not. But the key thing is to bring those practitioners together and provide them opportunities to interface with each other and to educate each other, but also bring in cyber and other experts to train people in those countries. Local content, localization. We have a project that we did in Rwanda, strangely enough, on content. One of the funniest things or odd things that we found when we were trying to encourage local ISPs to locally host content was that they didn't know the correct procedures to block certain ports, and they were spamming their own customers. So we took another look at this and worked with some technical experts from the region, trained the local ISPs to know what to do in order to build out that local ecosystem, because you're talking data centers, internet exchange points, local ISPs, and other. And if you want local content hosted locally, bringing down those price points again, and quality of service, because accessing local content is cheaper, better, faster, if you can do it. It's education, bringing people together, and expanding those webs of information among people as well.
Thank you so much. Hi, my name is Soledad Roybal, and my question is more about diversity and how you're thinking about it in the planning phases and what you're doing to address gender inequality. You know, there's so much culture involved there, and so much policy issues. So in your planning, how are you addressing these issues in the beginning so that you know how to deal with them as they come up in the future?
I'll start quickly. It starts with identity in the community, and that identity is whatever dimension that community, whatever language, whatever characterization or character element or profile that whatever language that community uses to define itself. I'll give you one small example. We cannot deploy these natural resources monitoring networks with indigenous communities unless that community gives us an approval. And it's not just a singular entity, but I'll be real clear. There are secret societies of sacred protectors in most of the 630 registered tribes in North America, and we need their approval, because their lives are built upon them making these commitments, these promises to 7 generations that they will protect water or land or climate or forest. And so we need their approval to come on site. We need their approval. We also need to talk with them about how the data can be a tool for a sacred water protector. So, sure.
Are you in those conversations, are you addressing the issue of, are you going to make sure that women have equal access to this, to these, I'm from New Mexico,
Sure.
I deal with indigenous communities all the time, and we have our own concerns about gender equality or just so many various issues. So are you actually having the conversation when you're meeting with the elders and the tribal leaders?
Are you actually saying, okay, but we want to make sure that it's not just going to be these families who are the main families, and I want to make sure are women or children or, you know, people who may only be, you know, 25% of, you know, who may, are they registered tribal members? Like, you know, there's so many complexities.
The vast majority of our partners in the indigenous communities in North America are women. The vast majority of them have a level of expertise in one part of the work we're doing or another that we quite frankly can't find in other places. And we are, in fact, when it comes to natural resources monitoring, using these tools, we're following the women who have the expertise and or the political or the tribal connections. And their mandate is quite simple. This is property of the Lakota Sioux. This is property of the Pine Ridge Reservation, Pine Ridge Resource Council, Pine Ridge people. And Joni Tobacco is the water resource manager for the Pine Ridge Oglala Sioux. She's an absolute superstar. So good or bad, with explicit bias or implicit, when it comes to natural resources, we believe that most of the leadership in most of those communities, at least our experience, has come out of the female leadership community. Our expectation is that it will likely continue to. I'm not even going to get into why that is, because it gets into a very deep conversation about that specific or particular community. But we are trying to emphasize that the identity of that community has to be the beginning of the conversation. Who are we today? Who do we reach back into when we define ourselves? What is it that we want to elevate? What is it that we want to fix or correct or put in a jar on the shelf and not revisit? And then what are the goals going forward? Who's going to be here among us? Who do we want to join us? Everything we do is analog, physical, carbon. I want to be clear about that. We're different in that we don't see people as profit potential, revenue potential, data potential, bag of water, or unfair burden. We see this, the people are the middle of this. The robots are just machines, and the machines are not partners. And we can't pretend for a second to be able to divine all of the undercurrents, swift moving or stagnant, of the relationships among and between the genders or the orientations or the religions or the sects or what have you. All we're trying to do is say, tell me who's here, tell me who you want to stay here, tell me who you want to bring here, tell me how it is that you want to be, and then we'll figure out if we've got tools that help you get there with resilience. But I will tell you, 2 young women from Nigeria and Cameroon asked me one time, what do you do between the doors? We were talking about gender equality and inequality. And I talked about what I did at home, and I talked about what I did at work. And Medel, Kanga, and Omotola Akinsola said, that's wonderful, Chris, that's beautiful, but what do you do between the doors? When you close the door to your home and before you open the door to your office, where you're not the king of your castle and you're not the boss of your team, where you're just another guy in the street, what are you doing about gender? This is what I'm trying to do about gender, and the indigenous communities in North America have not embraced. They've grabbed me by the neck and they've pulled me that way.
Can I add, this is not in a direct response to your point, but I think it gets at part of what is so important about what you're raising, which is that in addition to kind of blowing up all the things I think Chris listed earlier around technology, is this notion of what engagement means with communities, particularly communities that have largely been excluded, stereotyped, and disinvested in. And those are lots of different types of communities and lots of different people within communities. And one of the things that has come up for us that we're trying to do at the New School, and this came up in the context of sanctuary cities, but actually starting to think about, well, what is, I was in a salon with really, really activist technologists after the election. You can imagine why we were coming together. And the reality was they were all talking about privacy as a one-size-fits-all, as if everyone had all the same privacy concerns. And it became very clear that even though they were really wonderful, talented, committed people, they actually did not, and they weren't wrong in the pure technical sense, right? I mean, in terms of how technology works and what data is collected and but not actually understanding that people's vulnerability varies widely based on race, class, gender, religion. You could be Muslim and a citizen, and you're not necessarily any less vulnerable to security issues than if you're black, or Latino and undocumented, right? And so we actually started to put together these user profiles as a way to challenge some of the built-in assumptions that people weren't examining who were trying to be supportive technologists that were interacting with excluded communities. So I think the more and more we also think about the tools of engagement, which I think everyone on the panel has spoken to, and there are different kinds of, there's not a one-size-fits-all tool either, because there are different types of communities and different, but the more we can get clearer on the types of vulnerability, cultural sensitivities and exclusions people experience, the more we actually can approach those conversations in ways that are truly bottom-up inclusive, and also start to challenge some of the ways that those inequities get reproduced even at the community level.
And globally, the gender gap for access is bigger than the overall gap. And we certainly see that in the countries we're operating in. But it's largely cultural. In many countries, rural areas, the feeling is the only reason a woman would have a phone is to call her boyfriend and get into trouble. So if you have a phone, it's like having a scarlet letter. So what we're doing about that is there are efforts and organizations and countries reaching out, especially to young girls. Like there's a great organization called Girl Effect that actually operates in Rwanda. But for the people without connectivity, they really can't reach them. So as we build out areas, we try to partner with those people and say, hey, now you can go here. And now you can start targeting these people. And what we'd love to do, that we're doing in other areas, but not with gender yet, is work with an organization that we can do before and after studies. Because, in about 18 months, we will have covered 1 million people in rural Rwanda that have no connectivity today. It's a great opportunity to do a before and after study. There's enough communities you could probably even get a decent control. So I would love to partner with people doing that and seeing if we can figure out a way to make an effect.
I would also just add a note of caution. This is a mistake that I made. I thought I was being so fabulous and bringing a woman along on a trip to the United States when I was working in Armenia. I completely abolished all her chances for future trips and for promotion purposes at that time on that project, because the men on the project were jealous and they were in control. And so she, who had been a senior person, so be careful how you come into a certain situation, I would just say, particularly in other countries, because you could do more harm than good by forcing an issue and then quietly educating. To Chris's point about women in different indigenous communities, we've seen several projects that we've worked on and others where there are very strong women trying to promote that. And I would just say, find your champions, right? Don't assume you know who the champions are, and don't assume you know how best to do it, because it could really be damaging. I made that mistake myself.
Thank you very much for this insightful discussion about how we actually engage with these communities, and in our process of empowering them, we don't undermine that empowerment. But we are now out of time, so I'd like to thank the panelists for their great remarks. Thank you all.